Why is English the new global language, and how did it become so popular? Hello noble ones, and welcome to Metatron's Academy, the channel where we explore how to learn languages, and in this case about languages, in the most fun and effective way possible. And this is a list of languages by number of speakers. And as you look at such lists, one of the things you'll notice is that English is the most spoken language in the world as a second language, followed by Mandarin, and it is the third most spoken language in the world as a native language. Now, what this means is that right now, English is the de facto lingua franca. So what is a lingua franca? Any of various languages used as common or commercial tongues among people of diverse speech. But how does a language become a lingua franca? What are the cultural, historical, social, and linguistic phenomena that ignite such a status? Well, to summarize, one of the reasons why English has become a global language, or the global language it is right now, is because of some historical phenomena that occurred in the last 3 centuries that have to do with both the British Empire and the United States of America. We'll get to those in a second. And even though, as we were reading those lists, we noticed that it's not the mother tongue of the majority of people, it is the most sought out language to learn as a non-native or as a second language. To give us a little bit of a wider perspective as we are trying to address this question, one of the things we can do is to use the comparative key. So another language that historically, as many people know, has had a very strong and very similar position as lingua franca was, of course, Latin during the classical period, it being the language used by the Roman Empire. And even though Latin is not a lingua franca anymore, in fact, it's mostly a dead language, although once again, a dead language is not a language that isn't spoken, a dead language is a language that doesn't have native speakers. But still, Latin does not have the, of course, same global importance that it used to have in the classical period, but we can still see some of the vestiges of that specific position, which was very similar to the position English holds at this time, and we see them in the realm of diplomacy, scientific lingo, religion, both within the rituals and the fact that, for example, Latin is one of the official languages of the Holy See, even today. Although this is mostly kept for tradition rather than for necessity. But what makes English a successful lingua franca and global language? Well, one of the reasons behind this current status is the fact that English is the international and predominant language of business, of science, of technology, with Latin, believe it or not, still having some position when it comes to scientific terminology. English is also the international language of diplomacy, having taken the place and having supplanted a position that before was held by the French language. And historically speaking, probably one of the most significant moments when it comes to this dethroning, so to speak, is the Treaty of Versailles, which was written in both French and English. English is also the most common language when it comes to professional terminology. For instance, have a look at the way English is used in air traffic control. English is also the language of academia, as many as 96% of academic papers are now written in English. English has also become an incredibly useful language when it comes to international traveling. And if you've had any experiences when it comes to going to other countries, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. In our day and age, tourists coming from all over the place tend to use English as a means of communication, regardless of the fact that the country that they're going to visit perhaps does not even speak English or does not consider English to be their main language. How many times have you, for example, even as a European, have gone from a country such as Italy, where Italian is of course the official language, to Germany, where clearly German is the official language, but used English to communicate with the locals? And this has become such a no-brainer that in my experience as someone who travels a lot, I remember being, I'd try to say shocked, when I was in Japan and I saw a Japanese, a Korean, and a Chinese all communicating in English. Now, if that had happened, I want to say a couple of centuries ago, of course, probably they would have used Chinese. But this really shows the global influence English has to countries that are so far away, both geographically and linguistically. And even though today it might sound obvious that a Chinese and a Japanese use English to communicate, in an alternative reality, imagine an Italian and a French using Korean to communicate. This is how weird it really is to see a Chinese and a Japanese communicating in English. Now, the first reason or motive behind English popularity, I want to say has to do with a historical explanation. Of course, when you look at the modern situation, the United States of America having become a global power, particularly after World War I and World War II, that of course has given a massive boost to the importance of English as a lingua franca. But before that, the foundation of that groundwork was created by the British Empire. Now, one of the things about the British Empire is the fact that it had expanded so much and it had created so many colonies that as much as a fourth of the world was part of the British Empire by 1922, and a fifth of the entirety of the world population spoke English in a way or another. And this really has connections to what happened to Latin when the Roman Empire had expanded. Now, whether it be a military expansion, a military empire, whether it be a commercial empire, whether it be a cultural empire, empires tend to have the tendency of expanding everything that has to do with them, including their language. Lingua franca is always connected to power. And another characteristic of the language of power is that it tends to not coexist well with indigenous languages. In fact, it has the practice of replacing them. Another characteristic of a lingua franca is not just that it's forceful, but also that it's a language of prestige. Therefore, people who don't speak it have the tendency of having reasons why they would want to acquire it, in connection with personal status and societal growth. But not everything about a lingua franca or a global language is negative. In fact, one of the positive aspects is that it facilitates communication, which is one of the reasons why it becomes one of the official languages, if not the predominant language in diplomacy. With that being said, not everything has to do with the upper echelons of society and diplomats and countries speaking and communicating. Look at, for example, mass media and the internet. In our day and age, we could say that not only English has also become the language of technology, but it has also become the language that online and the internet uses as a means of communication between people of completely diverse and different cultures and languages. So in other words, to paint a more complete picture, we could say that a lingua franca or a global language is connected to economic power, military power, cultural influence, political influence. To give you an example of how you were impacted by the cultural influence of a global language, in this case English, think of all the movies and music in English that you were exposed to regardless of what country you were in from, and all the words that you learned and how motivated you were to try and understand these, how cool or in or hip it became for you to try and stand out, to say, yeah, I watch movies in English, I listen to music in English and I understand it, I read the lyrics. Now, all of this is of course impressive, but there is one thing that I'd like to bring up as my own personal theory, and it's the fact that English, from a linguistic, genetic standpoint, also is a language that had, we could say, an advantage or a predisposition into becoming a global language. Now look at the West and the main languages that are used here. You had English in England, German, all the Romance languages, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian. Europe itself is a very culturally and as a result linguistically diverse area. And yet we can sort of divide all languages in Western Europe into categories. The Germanic family, where you have English, German, all the Scandinavian languages, or Nordic languages should I say, and the Romance family with the languages I mentioned a second ago. English, in my opinion, is an excellent intermediary language between the Germanic reality and the Romance reality, because even though technically it belongs to the Germanic family, it is in fact the closest Germanic language to the Romance language family, it having 40% of its vocabulary being Latin rooted. This is of course for historical reasons. First the Romans conquer England, and then the Normans, so French speaking people in the Middle Ages, 1066 during the Battle of Hastings, then they conquer and influence England. If these two events hadn't happened, English would sound a lot closer to German than it does now. But because of this, English, in a way, it's the perfect connection between the Germanic and the Romance reality, which means that since it has so many things in common with both worlds, it's easy to learn if your native tongue is Germanic, but it's also easier to learn if your native tongue is Romance. And also from a grammatical and syntax standpoint, it tends to be easier than, say, Italian, German, and a bunch of other languages, and of course it's a lot easier than Mandarin to learn because it's not tonal based. You don't need to learn thousands of characters to be able to even read and write, and all of these factors give it a massive advantage when it comes to how easily accessible it is for people who want to learn it as a second language, which is what gave it its popularity in the first place, together with all the other reasons that we have explored here today. Now, in conclusion, one thing I'd like to talk about is a personal experience I had in Italy. So, I was born in 1982, so I'm 41 years old. One thing I remember is that when I was young, and I compared my ability to speak English to that of my parents, there was already a big difference in the sense that my parents, they knew nothing. Like my parents' generation, they just spoke Italian. Maybe they would know 1 or 2 words in English, but that was it. The previous generation did not have exposure to English. In fact, those who did, for example, my uncle, because he worked as a diplomat and lived in America for a few years, he could speak English, then he married an Australian. She learned Italian, by the way, because otherwise she couldn't have been able to communicate to the rest of the family. They were the exception. They were looked at, oh my gosh, that guy, he's a diplomat, that's why he knows English. My generation, however, was different. We had a higher exposure to English, but still English spoken fluently was not common at all when I was, say, 12 or 13. Heck, when I was in elementary school, it wasn't even mandatory. We didn't even learn languages, and when I entered middle school, the learning was not that good. Now, in my case, things changed because when I was a teenager, I moved to England, lived in the UK, picked up English, and then went back to Italy, and I felt like a superhero, to be honest. I was like very young, I could speak English fluently, I had a decent pronunciation, and pretty much no one else did. Now, when it comes to the current generation, the kids that are now 15, 16 in Italy, it's surprising how many of them actually speak English, and quite well. Now, how will this continue? Will English supplant every other language in the world? Will there be a constant bilingual status of all people? Or will there be a new language in the next couple of centuries that will take English's place? If you think about it, in the 19th century, French was the de facto lingua franca, and it only took a century or two to just supplant it completely. Will that happen again? And if it will, what language will take English's place as the new language of the planet? Well, if you have an opinion on that, please let me know in the comments below. And as always, thank you for joining Metatron's Academy.